Have you ever looked at a piece of code you wrote a while back and thought, what was I thinking? Sure happened to me. Today I'll show you 10 essential tips to keep your code simple, maintainable and easy to work with, which is what everybody wants, right? And of course I'll show plenty of Python examples. This video is sponsored by monday.com, more about them later. Let's dive in. In this video I'll use this code example. There's a employee class, it's a data class, and it has a couple of instance attributes, name, role, and a number of vacation days. And then there is a method, take a holiday, that lets an employee take a single holiday or pay out 5 holidays. Then if you scroll down, you see that there are then subclasses of this. There's an hourly employee, there's a salaried employee, there's a freelancer, there's an intern, and they each have different extra instance attributes depending on the type of employee that is. Then we have a company that has a list of employees where we can find various people, we can pay employees, also quite important. And then we have a notification system to inform employees of payments and holidays and things like that. So notification is an abstract base class, but then we have email notifications. Currently these are just print statements, just for an example, but we also have SMS notifications, and I used a factory pattern to create instances of these things based on the notification method that we want. I know this is rather complicated, but that's the whole point of the video. I start with a pretty complicated example that we're going to simplify. And then finally, I have a main function that creates a bunch of objects and calls some functions to see what actually is happening. So creating an employee here, adding it to the company, adding a few more employees. I find some different roles of people and I pay an employee. And then I'm going to take a holiday and then send the employee a message. So when I run this, we see that there are some results here, like various employees have been found. I'm paying an employee takes a holiday, and we're sending an email. Now, the first tip when you're looking at code like this is YAGNI. You ain't gonna need it. And that's actually a common trap for developers, to just build features, just in case. Over the years, I've become more and more strict with myself of not writing code that I'm not actually using at the moment. Because in the future, you probably won't need it because you're refactoring and changing things anyway. Because writing extra code also means you have to write extra tests. And you have to make sure that conceptually it fits within the framework of what you're building. You might need to do refactoring on that code that you don't use. So there's a lot of work that then goes into code that is actually not being used. In this case, well, it's not that bad because it's a relatively simple example, it's just a single file. But we have a few classes that are actually not being used. For example, the freelancer and the intern. These are both not being used. Now, it's possible that the company wants these classes because they know, oh, we're going to have freelancers and interns soon, so we want to have that support. But at the moment, these classes are not being used. So unless you have a very good reason for them being there, instead of just in case, then you should actually remove these. And that already removes quite a few lines of code. Another thing that happens once you remove classes that you don't need, you can probably remove more code that's not needed. For example, here I have pay employee, which pays employees depending on different employee types. Well, in this case, we can also remove all of this code because that's no longer needed. And of course, when I do that, it still works as expected because that code is not being used. The second tip is to not repeat yourself. Don't repeat yourself dry. That's a pretty common software design principle. If you repeat yourself, it leads to inconsistency and maintenance nightmares if you're in a really bad situation. If you copy-paste code instead of trying to come up with a more generic solution, you also introduce more places where you might need to fix bugs later on. An example here is the company class, which has find managers, find vice presidents, find support staff, etc. And all these methods, they basically have the same line of code, except that the only thing that changes is the role. So it means that if there is some bug in this list comprehension, then you're going to need to solve it in each of these different methods instead of just a single one. So it pays off in many cases to try and come up with a more generic solution so you can avoid these type of issues. So in this case, a simple way to solve that would be to have a find by role. And that's going to take self, and it's going to take a role as a string, and then we'll return a list of the employees that have this particular role. And now I can basically remove all of this stuff. So now that I have my find by role method, I can update the main function so that find vice president becomes find by role, and then I'm going to check the vice president, like so. And similar, I can do find by role manager. Actually, vice president should have dash, and we can also do support, like so. Let's run the code again, and we see that the result is exactly the same. But now I considerably simplified the company class by removing duplication. And by the way, you can't always remove all duplications. Sometimes that can actually backfire if you try to find a generic solution for something, but that makes it too generic, which means that you just end up with a bunch of boilerplate code. So you always have to find a balance there. The third tip is to avoid over-engineering. If you have a simple problem, you don't need a really complex solution for that. So don't introduce design patterns, framework, extra layers, etc. unless you really need them. An example of this is, I already mentioned it at the start of the video, the whole notification system. So I have an abstract base class here. I have email and SMS notifications and a factory that gives me instances of those things. That's pretty much overkill for what is supposed to be a relatively simple system. A much simpler solution actually just uses functions instead of this pattern. So what I would do is actually take this method here, and I would turn that into a function called send email. I remove the self. I remove the class here and also the notification class, no longer need. And same thing for SMS. I will do send SMS so that the function name is clear, self is no longer needed, and the class is no longer needed. And I also don't need the factory in this case, including this particular case where we're trying to handle an invalid notification method. So in this case, what we can do instead is not do all of this, but simply do send email. And then I don't need to do all of this work. Let's run this again, make sure that this works as expected, and it does. So now again, we've made this a lot shorter and simpler. And in general, that's actually my suggestion. If you want to keep your code simple, is to actually start with functions, because often they're simpler than classes. And then if you notice that you need them, if you notice that your code needs a way to group some data and apply some operations on that data, only then add classes. The fourth tip is that you need to organize yourself better. If you want to create simple software, you need to also have simple processes for organizing and managing your software development projects. For example, at ArjanCodes, we use Kanban boards for everything to keep it pretty simple, and it works really well. Also, if your projects are scattered across a bunch of different platforms, it's going to be really annoying. You know, your deadlines start slipping, you're not using your resources, your team effectively, and time and money is wasted. And that leads to software that's just not as good as it can be. With today's sponsor, Monday.com, your entire development team can collaborate effortlessly. Think of it as your sleek, all-in-one workspace where you can assign tasks, set deadlines, and track everything all at a glance. You can plan roadmaps, manage your sprints, release projects fast on one flexible platform. In my own experience, setting this up well makes a massive difference. Whether you need Kanban boards, Gantt charts, calendar views, Monday.com has you covered. Switch between different views to see your projects from every angle and stay on top of everything. You can automate engineering work so you can focus on developing your product instead of doing repetitive administrative work. And on top of this, Monday.com integrates with GitHub, Jira, Slack, and more. Monday.com's dashboards give you a clear snapshot of your projects and team's performance to give you instant insights without having to dig through spreadsheets or reports. And using a platform like Monday.com means that as a team, you can work more asynchronously. You'll need less meetings and you get more work done. If you're ready to take your productivity to the next level and keep your projects and teams organized, head to the link in the video description to try Monday.com for free today. The fifth tip is to keep your functions short and do one thing. In other words, cohesion. If you have long functions with many lines of code that do lots of different things, they're going to be really hard to understand, hard to test, and also hard to work with. Each function should have a single clear responsibility. So an example here is that we have in our employee class a take a holiday method. Now this actually does multiple things. It lets the employee take a single holiday or it pays out 5 holidays. And there's this if-else statement that basically handles these two different cases. In this case, you can actually detect already in the signature that there is an issue with this function because the payout boolean already indicates that there is too much going on here, that there's two options, two different things that this function does. You can also take a look sometimes at the name of a functional method, and if there is or inside it, take holiday or pay out a holiday, then you know that the function is doing too many things and you should probably split it up. So here what I would do is I would add a new method called payout holiday. And then you can take this like so. I remove the boolean here, and then I'm going to call this take a single holiday, because that is what the method is actually doing. I'll remove this code as well, and I'll de-indent this. And then of course I have to change here. So here I'm going to change this to take a single holiday, and I don't need the boolean anymore. And now let's run that code and we get exactly the same outcome, except now if you look back at the employee class, you see that we have two methods now that each do one specific thing. Sixth tip is to avoid hard-coded values. And that's actually another problem with these methods right here, and that they have hard-coded values. For example, here payout holidays has the number 5, which is hard-coded. You could even say that take a single holiday has a hard-coded 1. So you might also want to make that more generic, especially here with the 5 days that appears here and here. So if you want to change that, you need to now modify it in 2 places and make sure you don't forget about it. So ideally, these type of constant values need to be defined separately from your code. And that can be in a database, you can do that in a config file, etc. Now, the simplest solution, if you don't want to create a config file, is to at least put these type of hard-coded values in a constant and put that at the top of the file so that it's easy to find and modify. So here I can create a payout holidays days, and that's equal to 5. And I'm going to take this constant value and then I'm going to replace the 5 by that. So now if I change this, I only have to change it in one place. So that makes it much easier. Tip number 7 is to use meaningful names. If you use good names, that eliminates the need for comments. For example, if you take a look at this freelancer class that I removed before, there are some instance variables that don't really have a clear name. It's, for example, unclear what amount and retainer actually means and what are their units, right? So instead of this, you could write something like hours per month. And then we know, oh, it's about hours and it's on a monthly basis. And for the retainer, you can do something that is very similar. So we could instead call this monthly retainer. So we know that this is about 1 month and not for a year or something. This is already much clearer, but of course you might still think that those names are not very clear yet. It's kind of up to you to decide how far you want to take this. In short, actually naming things is really hard, and there's not always a single best solution to it because developers will have different opinions about names as well. Tip number 8 is to document your thought process and not just what the code does. That means that if you add comments to your code, you need to write a short explanation that explains why something is done, not just how. If you take a look at the code right here, you see that there's a comment that checks whether self.vacation days is less than 1. Now, this is not really a useful comment because we can actually see that right from the code. Instead, you want to write comments that explain why we're doing certain checks. So here we can do a check whether the employee still has holidays left. And now this is a much clearer explanation of why we're doing this particular check right here. So don't just describe what's happening, but actually explain why you're doing it. And by the way, if you want to get better at diagnosing code and detecting issues like this, check out my free code diagnosis workshop at ArjanCodes/diagnosis. This teaches you how to spot design problems like this and help you improve your code more effectively. The link is also in the video description. Now I have 2 more tips, and then there's a bonus tip that actually makes a big difference. Tip number 9 is to not overcomplicate your module structure. Flat is overall better than nested. You want to avoid unnecessary folders and layers and only introduce structure when it's actually needed. As an example, I created a modular version of this employee system, and that's right here in this folder. So as you can see, there is the ops folder. We have company. Inside company, there's company.py, which is the actual company that we had before. We have a config folder that's currently mostly empty. Then we have employees. There's an employee class. Then there's types, which has the different types of employees. So if you take a look at this structure, there's way too many folders and subfolders for code that is of this complexity. I mean, the example is not that complex, but it does look very complex by having this structure in place. And that also means that at the moment, importing things is quite cumbersome. For example, if you take a look at the main file, you see that we need to import company from ops.company.company because, well, we put company inside a company folder. So in this case, that extra level is not needed at all. We can simplify this, for example, by simply moving this and then removing this company folder. And now I can just import it like so. And that's much simpler. And same for employees. I mean, do we really need a different folder of employee types? I don't think that really adds anything in particular. So let me just move these up to the employees folder, remove types. And that also means I can clean up my imports right here, like so. And in my main file, I don't need to include this either. Now you can, of course, explicitly import these in an init.py file to make at least the imports a bit simpler when you use the package. But overall, it's simpler to keep the structure a bit flatter and not add more complication than necessary. Finally, the config folder is currently empty, so I'm simply going to remove that. You ain't gonna need it. Start simple and refactor only when necessary. The final tip before the bonus is to write tests for critical code. So simple code is code that doesn't break. So once you organized everything into modules, not too many, you kept things simple, then writing tests is also much easier. In essence, writing tests actually helps you keep things modular and clean because you have no choice. You have to organize things, and that's one of the great benefits of writing tests. So how do you do that? So if you have your ops folder right here, then you typically would have a test folder that follows the same structure. So here I have, for example, test notification. And that actually tests the notification file right here. So this sends emails and sends SMSs. So this is not a full suite of tests. I just added this as an example. But as you can see, I do keep the same structure. I write test underscore in front of it, as well as the function. And then I'm writing a simple test. So in this case, I'm testing sending an email, and I'm using capsys that captures the system out. That's something that's built into PyTest, which is really nice. And what I do here is simply create an employee. I create a message. I send the email to the employee. I capture the standard out, and then I assert that this is actually the message that we got. And when I run this, you see that this particular test passes. And then what you would typically do is for each file, you would add a file right here in your test folder, and you would also create subfolders for the various tests. So for example, there is an employee subfolder. So now I would also create an employees subfolder in the test folder. That way, if you're working on employees, then it's also easy to find it back in the test. Finally, the bonus tip: spend about 10% of your development time on refactoring. Refactoring is basically a necessity. You're always working on improving your code, and you need to always spend a bit of time there. If your code gets messy, you need to clean it up before it slows you down too much. So what I typically do is small, frequent refactors instead of working on code, adding a bunch of features, and then once in a while having to do a big update and having tons of technical debt that you need to remove. If you keep it small and frequent, then your refactors are going to help you prevent technical debt. And I typically spend about 10% of my time doing that, refactoring, improving the code. And it helps me set up for success because then later on it's easier for me to add new features or make more improvements to the code. And actually it helps me learn more about the domain and about how things fit together, because once I have my code base, I can start moving things around, reorganizing things, and at the same time gain a better understanding of how everything fits together. Now, here's a nice exercise that I like to do from time to time. I highly recommend you do that as well. Take a piece of code that you're not particularly happy with, something that's not too large, but also not too small, and then start working on it. Make it simpler. Reorganize things, add some abstraction. And here's the trick. Go on refactoring that code much longer than you would typically do. You're going to reach a point where you feel like any changes you make in the design are just going to make things worse, or they don't really change things all that much. And that's when you know you're done. Now, of course, you don't always have to take it that far when you're just writing regular code, but it's a very instructive exercise because this forces you to think about design alone and not about adding more features. Anyway, which of these tips do you already follow? Do you have your own favorite techniques for keeping your code simple? Let me know in the comments. I've talked a bit about software testing in this video. If you want to learn more about that, including a very simple way to set it up in VS Code, watch this video next. Thanks for watching and see you next time.